Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fiddler AI Explained, another edition that we are bringing. We'll wait for a few minutes so that people can join. We have an exciting guest today on our webinar. So today the session is about AI regulations, specifically about EU AI Act. So if you have any specific questions or things that you want to know, please let us know. There's a chat section for you to ask questions. You can post there, and someone from our team should be able to facilitate those questions to answer. Okay, good morning and good afternoon for those of you who are joining across the world. We are here to talk to you about EU AI Act. I'm Krishna Gade. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fiddler. I'll be your host today. Today's session will also be recorded and sent to all the attendees. We have a very special guest on today's AI Explain, and that is Kevin Schwansky, CEO and co-founder of Modulus AG. Welcome, Kevin.
It's a pleasure to be here, Krishna.
Awesome. Kevin is the co-founder and CEO of Modulus, and he leads the mission to develop and operate AI products and services in a new regulated era through their Modulus AI governance platform. Kevin, maybe before we go into it, would you like to say something more about yourself, how you started the company, what you do for our audience?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to join this forum here. I'm actually by training an astrophysicist, and I got into AI and machine learning something like 10 years ago when we thought it was a bubble, but of course it was barely the beginning of what it is today. And I left academia to found Modulus, first thinking about responsible AI, trustworthy AI, and finding methods to help people build better models. And then about 3 years ago, we saw the early draft of what is now the EU AI Act. And we read this document and we tried to understand what this implied if it became a law. And we realized this is a fantastic opportunity to build a product for an era that's very different from the one we're used to, one where AI is a regulated product and it's a regulated activity. And that's how the Modulus AI governance platform was born.
Awesome. That's actually a great segue into our current topic, Kevin. This has been, the last few weeks has been a big week for AI regulation. Within California, we have had Kevin Newsom pass a bunch of regulations, including the one aspect of California AI Act. Maybe let's start with, what is EU? Could you tell our audience what it is and the details?
The best mental frame for thinking about the AI Act is GDPR. In 2016, the EU decided to set effectively global standards for data privacy and data protection. And even though it's a European regulation, it had echoes around the world, in the United States and other countries. We had to start thinking and work seriously on data protection and privacy. The EU saw this and decided that one of the next things they wanted to do is regulate AI. GDPR covers the data side, and they wanted to cover the algorithm side. And we can go further later on in what the EU really means by AI, because it's not what we have in mind when we hear the word. And yeah, the EU did early studies on how they would want to go about this. And they settled on two decisions that are fundamental, but that were not obvious. I don't think these were obvious decisions. And now when we talk about AI regulation, in whatever country or forum we're talking about, these two decisions are more or less assumed to be the way we do AI regulation. So the first one is that we don't regulate the technology. So the AI Act doesn't tell you how many layers you're allowed to have in your neural network or what your F1 score needs to be. It regulates the product that contains AI. And it actually doesn't care what kind of AI it is. It could be the latest LLM, or it could be a very simple logistic regression. You've now built an AI product, and so you're covered. That's decision number one. And then decision number two was to say the obligations you have, the things that you need to do in order to have a compliant product, scale with the risk of the application. So the same AI model, when it's used to decide whether you get credit or not, is much riskier than if it decides whether a certain email is spam. And so this risk-based approach is something that's being copied by basically everyone. And then as a final point that I think is interesting and is not well known about the AI Act is that it has a certain structure, and that structure is inherited from the regulation that many of the writers worked on before the AI Act, and that's the medical device regulation. So the regulation that if you want to bring an X-ray machine or an insulin pump to market in Europe, that's the medical device regulation. And the AI Act has a similar structure. So when you think about, okay, what is this AI Act all about? How does it work? Think about the steps you would take if you wanted to bring a medical product to market. And then a lot of things fall into place.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think a lo- one of the things that happened this week is like the governor of California vetoed SB 1047, although there were some other regulations like SB 942 were passed, right? So there's always this concern when people talk about AI regulations, whether it will add bottlenecks to AI development. And there's always like the crowd is like divided upon that. Can you tell us what EU AI Act will do here? What's your view? Will it help open up the AI market in the EU or add further bottlenecks?
So the EU is being broadly criticized for stifling innovation with the AI Act. The US invents and the EU regulates. And I think that in this situation is slightly unfair because in the EU, there are now clear rules and clear timelines on what you're supposed to do in order to have a product in the market. In the US, where of course most of the AI innovation happens, we have a much more piecemeal, haphazard approach to AI regulation. We have the executive order from President Biden, basically directing the agencies to draw up standards and actually already start enforcement. So in Europe, we still have 22 months left. In the United States, the regulatory agencies are already bringing cases to court. And of course, because there's no federal law in the United States, the individual states are cooking up their own laws. So California, of course, is working on many of those, but most of the other states are looking at their own laws, and Colorado's already passed their own AI.
Yeah, makes sense. So then, like, how should a US company think about the EU AI Act? How does it affect, say, a large enterprise company that may have distribution of their products or services in EU, or even maybe a startup that wants to capture EU
Mhm.
market?
Yeah, you had exactly the right phrase at the end. If you want to capture the EU market, think about it again, like GDPR. It's a European rule. But as long as your data has anything to do with Europeans, even if you're a US company, you have to start thinking about it. So there's an extraterritorial aspect to these European laws. This is by design. This is not a mistake. This is absolutely wanted. And so if if you're an American company, whether you're a startup or whether you're a giant enterprise, you will fall under the AI Act as long as your product or service is available in the and for that it might be sufficient that if I'm in Germany or if I'm in Spain and I can log onto your website and I can procure a service, that's certainly sufficient. And there can even cases where if the output from your system has a material effect in the EU, even though both your company and your customer are in the US and Canada, um, if that output has a material effect in the EU, you might also be covered. And even though um, you're not located physically in the EU, this is definitely something you should pay attention to.
Yeah, makes sense. Let's actually step back a little bit. People talk about model governance all the time, especially in the last few years. As you articulated, there are many governments rolling out guidelines and many companies advertise themselves subscribing to responsibility principles. What are some of the things that people need to think about model governance when it comes to generative AI? Because I feel machine learning has been a well-studied problem, especially when it comes to model governance. But what's your point of view when it comes to generative AI, which is different from machine learning? And how
Mhm.
does one think about model governance for generative AI?
So the approach that the AI Act takes and that a lot of these regulatory frameworks take is ultimately it's about consumer protection. And so what's inside the box is less important than what the box does. That said, Gen AI brings its own challenges to dealing with questions like transparency, like traceability, and of course then the challenges of bringing Gen AI to production when you need to think about guardrails and AI cybersecurity. Um, the more recent regulatory frameworks, both the thinking in the EU um, but also in the United States, focus specifically on what are those technical challenges to do with Gen AI. And I think there's a lot of thinking, a lot of good work going on trying to find best practices. So I don't think the laws anytime soon are going to tell you how to use LLMs, but a lot of the best practices and the technical standards are talking about Gen AI.
Yeah. So there's one difference in Gen AI compared to traditional machine learning, right? In machine learning, most teams train their model from scratch. They might use libraries like TensorFlows, like scikit-learn, whatever. They can train their own model on their data. But with Gen AI, you have all these pre-trained models that vendors give you, Microsoft, Google, all these players, open source as well. There are lots of these pre-trained models that you could then leverage, do your own prompt engineering and fine tuning. Now, how do you then apply governance? What, and then first of all, how do you even regulate? Because there's this conflict between the developer of the pre-trained model and the deployer. So could you just talk about those nuances?
Sure. Gen AI has additional challenges for exactly the point that you outlined here, which is that you're taking a pre-trained model from someone and then you're building your own product based on that. And the way the regulators tend to look at it is if you're building with it, you assume a lot of the responsibility for it. And simply saying, I took the pre-trained model from this provider or that provider is not going to be much of a defense if your product causes harm. And so that means in this new regulated AI era, you should think very carefully about whose pre-trained model or whose general purpose AI is the term the Europeans now use, you're going to use. The Europeans required the general purpose AI models, that is the big pre-trained LLMs, to make certain disclosures within 12 months. So this is now in 10 months, where they have to deliver, amongst other things, a very detailed model card that ought to include details on what data the model was trained on and how it was trained and what safeguards it includes. Now, if you're going to be building with those models, you want that information, not just from a technical perspective, but also from that regulatory perspective, so that you know exactly what you built with and what risks you took by using the model. And I think a big question is just how detailed those disclosures will really be. And a question that I have is whether maybe some of the big Gen AI foundation model companies might choose to just not make the disclosure and say, look, this model not for use in the EU. That might well happen.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, so just to give an example, if like an enterprise customer, like a bank or an
Mhm.
airlines company that is operating in the EU and using one of these pre-trained models, then I have to have a model card that not only tells about how I fine tune this model, but also how the original model was trained, the pre-trained model was trained.
Yeah, because it's a product safety, product liability approach, not a technological approach. So just as you can't like make a toy and just put a component in there that you have no idea what it is, so you can't build an AI application in your bank or in your insurance where you don't know what's in it, right? The saying, I got it from somewhere, that's not going to cut it. And this
Right.
change, by the way, goes further, right? If you if you take one of those pre-trained models and you build an AI product out of it, right? You wrap it, you have an API, license that product, and then somebody else purchases it. You then pass that responsibility along, like you're responsible. And then the person or the company licensing your product also takes on some of the responsibility. So there's a whole new set of liabilities along the AI supply chain that will keep going.
So can you just articulate a little bit more of what should go into this model card? What should I be prepared in terms of showcasing it to the potential regulator that might ask for this thing? What are some of the aspects that I need to think about as a customer?
The OECD model card and data set cards are generally considered a very good example of what that should look like. It's, by the way, it's also the template that Hugging Face uses. So if you get the Hugging Face template, you have a pretty good start. If you're providing one of those Gen AI models, there's a whole article in the AI Act that you should study, and there are some things in there that even I still have some open questions on what that really means. And I think one of the things that's going to be contentious is that you have an obligation to tell what data you train on at the level of detail so that copyright holders can enforce their rights. And of course, that's a very loaded subject.
Got it. And there was an interesting question relevant to what you just talked about. If it's a pre-trained model, how does it comply with the EU's right to forget? So how are you going to ask the vendor to forget some data or forget some training examples?
This is a fascinating question. I've talked to quite a few lawyers from different European countries about this. I think there's no strong conclusion to this question. So let me backtrack and explain a little bit what Krishna, what you are addressing here. So if I'm your customer under the GDPR, I have the right to tell you, look, delete all my data. I don't want you to know anything about me anymore, and you have to comply. So now, if I've trained a $100 million or $1 billion foundation model on that data, and I come to you and say, you got to forget everything about me, it's not clear how you would do that. I know that some companies have essentially used guardrails where they have filters during inference where they will try to filter out if somebody has essentially pressed that right. But the question whether I can ask you to essentially delete me from your model weights is an open question, and we'll have to see what the courts decide.
Because it's even if it's a fine-tuned model, it's you don't have controls into the original data that that was used to train the pre-trained model. So it's going to be interesting how this regulation gets implemented. Maybe going into the little bit of more details of EU AI. Let's walk through some of the practical steps. What should an organization do to implement transparency and responsible AI required by the AI Act? So, for example, things like monitoring, governance, model testing. Could you walk us through like some of the practical steps? What are the processes and things that an organization should put in place?
Sure. So the first thing that everyone should do, as long as they suspect they would be in any way covered by the AI Act, is make an inventory of all the AI applications you have. And if you do that, you'll be surprised by how many more AI applications you're really running. And here I'll just do a 10-second detour. The definition of AI is not a scientific or technical one. It's a legal one. And very simple algorithms, a linear regression, an if-then-else statement, could be considered AI under these new legal definitions. In fact, the US is more practical. They more and more use the phrase automated decision system, and then it's much more helpful to realize what we're really talking about. So you need this inventory, and you need to figure out how risky those applications really are. And one thing I would stress, this is extremely important because there's almost no time left. Find the prohibited applications. The prohibitions kick in at the end of January next year. And if you're found to be operating a prohibited AI system, that's a 7% of global turnover fine. So The prohibition that you're most likely to be operating today are so-called real-time biometrics and real-time emotional recognition manipulation systems. So the classic case here is those HR interview softwares where you see my video here, and then on the side it says, "Oh, Kevin, he's really nervous and he's probably lying right now." Those are probably illegal very soon. So make sure you take those out of commission. Beyond that, the steps you should take is you should have a multi-stakeholder process to set up your governance processes. And the most important thing to do there is have an institutional policy on how you're using AI. This is to be a document both about processes, but also about your values. Like, what is it you expect of your AI systems? What is it that you expect of your developers and your users and your customers? And then on the more technical side, the AI Act expects you to have a quality management system. So this is analogous to the quality management system that I'm sure many of the attendees have in their company already, but it has to be one specifically for AI. It operates slightly differently from a traditional quality management system. And the other thing you have to have is a risk management system. So again, most bigger companies will have one or more risk management systems, but this has to be an AI risk management system. And this is where your question about how does it go into the technical field, AI risk management means you have to continuously monitor the risks posed by your AI system. And if you have evidence that the risk is above a threshold or has increased from managed to not managed, you should act on it. So that means whatever model you have in production, you should be monitoring and making sure that the risks it poses, and these could be risks for discrimination or for error or for actually environmental risks and other types of risks as well, that you constantly monitor and mitigate them. And setting that up in practice it can be a challenge. But of course, it's something that connects to infrastructure that if you deploy AI models that you already have, because you should be monitoring your models and you should know how they're behaving.
Awesome. So that's a great point, right? Of course, you're an AI monitoring company, and one of the things that we get questions from our customers who are regulated is, what should be my thresholds? How do I monitor it? What thresholds would pass regulatory oversight? And does EU AI Act, again, I know the answer, but I think for the audience, would it prescribe the thresholds? Say, hey, you can't have below 80% hallucination or 20% hallucinations, or you can't have this much of bias in your models and things like that.
I wish there was a nice appendix to the AI Act that give you quantitative answers to all those questions. And of course it doesn't, right? A law is written by lawyers and by parliaments, and it has very general language. So the AI Act will say something like, your training data must be sufficiently representative towards the groups or individuals affected. So that's a nice legal phrasing, but as an engineer, as a data scientist, what am I going to do with that, right? This is a real challenge. So the first principle I would take here is, in the absence of a long record of court cases and decisions, as long as you're engaged in a good faith effort, I think you're going to be fine. So this means you have to have a well-maintained risk management system where you explain, look, these are the parameters or these are the metrics that we're monitoring. And we've decided, look, we just don't want this fairness metric to exceed this threshold for reasons that might not be too deep, maybe something you determine empirically or think sounds reasonable. As long as you have a process in place, as long as you show that you adapt, I think in most cases you're going to do well if challenged. I think this will change over time, and I think we'll get industry standards in specific verticals.
That's actually a good segue to this new industry standard called ISO 42001 that is emerged. Could you talk about what that standard is, how an organization can get certified for that standard, and what does
Mhm.
it mean to get an ISO 42001 certification? How does it regulatory oversight?
So 42001 it's called AI management system. And so if you're familiar with information security, there's ISO 27001, and there's also SOC 2, which if you run a software company, you have to go get that to prove that you're dealing with information security well. And if you're buying software for an enterprise, you want to have vendors that can prove that they're responsible and proactive in their information security. 42 is the equivalent for AI systems. It's an ISO standard, which means it's international, which means it's not specific to the AI Act. And it basically describes how to set up the management system for AI. So this includes the quality management, the risk management, the responsibilities, the taxonomies, all the things that you need generically in order to set up this management system. Now, the good thing about 42001 is this is a finished standard. It was published late last year, and you can get certified for it today. This is actually what we as Modulus is one of the things that we help you do, is help you build a management system that can be certified so that you can show to your vendors, your customers, that you have a trustworthy system. Now, is this enough for conformity with the AI Act? That's a political question that doesn't have an answer today.
Got it. And so now, like when you actually are setting up these standards, one of the things that people ask about it is what are things that I should monitor from an AI application perspective? What are the metrics that I need to monitor? Will they specified in the certifications that we talked about, or are they specified verbatim in this AI Act, or is it something that I have to, as a data scientist and model developer, need to come up
You still have to come up with based on your use case and what your company's mission is. These ISO standards, they tell you about processes.
with?
They say, this is the steps you should follow, but they don't tell you, and then your equalized odds fairness needs to be consistent with this. They don't do that in particular also because they are international and generic. That guidance that we all want, what metric do I need to hit, right? This is very much an engineer question to ask. We all want it, but I think we're years out from having clarity on that.
Got it. And what are some of the most common metrics that you are seeing amongst people, customers, and organizations you're working with as they try to prepare for AI, EU AI Act? What are some of the things that they're trying to monitor and evaluate?
So when I talk to customers about fairness metrics, one of the most interesting things that happens is that it puts people on the spot to actually define their values and write them down in code. And it's always fascinating to watch because everybody thinks, let's just make the model fair. And then you have this discussion of, do we prefer equality of opportunity or do we prefer equality of outcome? And you get to watch these fascinating discussions as companies start to figure out what are our values. Now in Europe, there's nothing to hang yourself on and guide you. What's interesting is that the one country that really has a quantitative standard you can use today is the United States with disparate impact, which is a long tradition in jurisprudence. And at least that is something that you can use in a quantitative way.
But and what about other things? For example, does EU AI Act talk about accuracy of models like hallucinations, which is a very big topic these days with generative AI? And have you seen people track metrics around those things?
So I see people tracking a lot of these metrics that go into a confusion matrix if it's a classifier. I see a lot of people working with LLM guardrails. This is a very hot topic right now. But then when we step back and we think about the process, what are you trying to achieve? So you're trying to build a Gen AI application. You're trying to build a chatbot. So you think about what are my priorities? What are my risks, right? That my chatbot is toxic, my chatbot leaks PII, that my chatbot accidentally sells the company for $1, right? And so by listing those risks and saying, okay, if the chatbot sold the company for $1, that would be really bad. Let's prevent that. That then leads you to setting up the guardrail. And then you go back and say, okay, now we've mitigated, not eliminated, but we've mitigated the risk of the chatbot doing something we don't want. And that's the process that ISO 4201, but also the AI Act and other standards, that's what they want you to do. Think about what could go wrong here and what technical means do we have to mitigate it? And how well does it work?
So I think with, with the fact that there is no specific set of metrics that authorities want you to monitor, so it comes down to the process, right? So is there a expected process that is outlined in this regulation? This is one of the audience questions as well. Is there an expected process that one needs to follow to be regulatory proof?
Very much so. And at a high level, it looks like this. Think about the risks that your system poses to something, let's say a quality. You list those and you assess them by how serious they are. Like, how likely is it? How high is the impact? What's the impact on the business if it happens? And then once you've assessed, okay, we have a risk from our system here to discrimination. Okay, we've assessed that we need to do something about it. Let's think about strategies for addressing it. Can we have a simple solution here? Do we need to use a totally different model? What do we do here? You assess the solutions and then you implement them and you see how you do. And if you've mitigated the risk sufficiently, you say, I've succeeded, and then you monitor it, right? Because we all know models start misbehaving after some time. And so maybe after a while, it comes back. And then you start the process again. You say, what do I do here on a technical level to get the model to be within parameters again? That's at a high level, the process.
Yeah, it's very similar to uh, we work with banks in the United States. They have this SR11 guideline that you probably also know, the model risk management, and they have the same sort of. Do you have a process to test and verify your models before? Are you monitoring them? You have periodic reports, and then it's like the sophistication of the process is
Hmm.
more or less gives the company a regulatory blessing. Like,
Hmm.
we have heard oftentimes from fintechs and banks that the more sophisticated tooling and processes that you can show to a regulator, the more satisfied they would be in some ways, giving you the sort of the blessing that you're okay on these regulations. Cool. So I guess when it comes to practically getting one of these certifications, right? You mentioned modulars does that. Maybe could you talk about how you go about doing it? What are some of the assessments that you do in the process
Hmm.
to help a company get certified?
So we give you an out of the box AI management system platform. So it has all the control frameworks. It has a risk management system. It has the way to integrate into whatever monitoring stack you're using. And we give you the guidance on starting with the documents maybe you already have and starting to set up the system. We're a software company, so many of our customers actually also then engage, yeah, a consulting partner that has experience with this to help them set this up. And then there's a process. It's a little bit similar to other audits where after you've set up the system, you do a phase one audit, and then you have to operate the system for a while, and then you can get your phase two audit done, and then you have your certification done. And then you need to, of course, maintain it. Nobody's done this for 42001 yet, but then maybe every year you have to be reviewed by the auditor to maintain the certification. And so we give the infrastructure for that. We give the automation for that. And then we work in concert with consulting partners and auditors to help the customers get there.
Awesome. So then switching gears, right? It seems like a lot of the responsible AI governance, people think that it's a large company thing. You're like a very large enterprise and you have to worry about it. But how do you think this EU will impact startups? There are so many new startups that are coming up with generative applications. What are the opportunities and challenges maybe both startups and these larger enterprises face in terms of eh, getting ready for this situation?
I think startups and large enterprises have slightly different pain points or things that they're going to find tough. I talk to a lot of startups and they're scared. They think this is going to cost so much money, so much effort, so much time. How can we do this? Maybe the American ones, maybe we should just avoid the EU market for now. And I would actually suggest that they look at it the other way around. having responsible AI and becoming certified is no different from doing it for information security or for data protection. These are quality signals to your buyers, to your customers. These are promises to your customers that you are reliable and that you are trustworthy. And instead of seeing it as a blocker, I think the sooner you do it, the more you have an edge over your competition who won't do it. And on the other side, you have the enterprise organizations. The first thing they do is when they're going to be buying AI from now on is say, where is your 42001? Until now, they've asked, where's your SOC 2? And I think
So just to clarify
yeah,
that if I'm a generative AI startup, I'm actually selling my SaaS software to a large enterprise. You're telling me that large enterprise might ask me to showcase, hey, do I have a 42001 certification on my head? Just like how,
yes,
we get asked for SOC 2 compliance and things.
this is already happening. There's several large tech companies I'm aware of who have notified their vendors to produce the 42001 ASAP or be dropped. Yeah. And this is the other side, right? As an enterprise, in this new era of regulated AI, you want to be sure that you know what it is you're buying, and you want to be satisfied that what you're buying, the people behind it, the company behind it, is trustworthy and doesn't just do it once, but can continue to maintain AI that isn't going to get you in trouble.
Yeah, makes sense. I think so. What it means is it's not just checkbox that you want to complete. It's actually an enabler for your business, right? Whether it's a small company or a large enterprise, this is going to be an enabler for you in the future. So
I think
maybe,
so.
yeah. So maybe related would be like, how does this EU differ in its impact across industries? We have different industries. Everyone is now impacted by retail, finance, care. Are there specific provisions tailored for each of the industries, and how does it impact these different verticals?
And the AI Act is funny. So it has this famous Annex 3 where it says what's particularly high risk.
Mm.
And it's this strange mixture of things that are highly specific and then things that are so generic where we'll just have to find out what it means. So for example, anything to do with HR or with education or with administration of justice or public services, anything the government does, is considered high risk. But then you have provisions like critical digital infrastructure. And now we can have a long discussion about whether something is critical digital infrastructure or not. The way I read it, as long as if the infrastructure fails, there could be some real world harm, you could be considered critical. But we don't really know ultimately where that line will be. Yes, there's some verticals that are directly name checked, but these sort of broad categories mean that it could mean almost anyone. By the way, this is different from the approach in the United States and also the approach by ISO, where the sort of risk tiering by vertical doesn't apply at all. So in the ISO standard, you're supposed to figure out yourself how risky you are. And the same thing with the NIST AI risk management framework. You go through it and you see what are your risks. There's no guidance. Oh, if you're in healthcare, then you need to do this.
Yeah. So basically, then there's a related question as well from the audience on determining the risk classification, right? So many conditions you mentioned, the regulations themselves have differences in terms of how they approach it. So then, like, how do, if for example, if I'm trying to, if I'm like in a particular, even within a vertical, so if I'm a healthcare company, I may have models from clinical diagnosis to customer support, right? So with various
Mhm.
varying different risks. How do I go about this risk classification, and how
Yeah.
do I get ready for this AI regulation in general?
Okay. This is a perfect as a joint question. So I think in general, you should have some AI governance in place and you should be ready to substantiate whatever AI system you use, that you understand its risks and that it meets certain quality levels. The legal question of whether in the EU you considered high risk is, of course, very consequential, because if you are high risk, you have to go through this thing called conformity assessment, which is basically like an audit process, and you have to register with the EU and you have to do a lot of bureaucracy. And of course, if you get that wrong, that could The way to think about that is you should treat all your applications with some level of care so that if it turns out, oh, you should be in the high risk category, that it's maybe a lot less work for you to turn that around instead of having your product basically be taken off the market for 6 months or a year.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. So I guess, what do you see the impact of EU influencing the global AI standards beyond Europe? It seems like everyone is it copying this stuff, or what's your take?
I used to joke that even the Pope now is calling for AI regulation because he really did. What I find interesting about the process is that these two assumptions that we regulate the product, not the technology, and that it's risk based, was copied basically by almost everyone. There's few places where AI regulation really diverges from that. Actually, one of those places is China, though I know less about the Chinese AI regulation. So the structure is going to be similar in most markets, most countries around the world. The details will differ. I find it interesting and how in some countries you notice that they more or less cut and paste from the AI Act. And I would caution against that because of course that language is heavily loaded with Brussels insider language that is very meaningful, that if you cut and paste it into another country's culture and language, suddenly just make no sense anymore. Caution against that. One trend we're seeing, particularly in the US, thinking forward and thinking more about Gen AI, is going back to this more technology specific regulation, particularly saying, this is how we want you to use LLMs. These are best practices for LLMs. That's I think, the biggest divergence we're seeing right now from the EU approach versus the US approach.
Yeah, so it seems like most people are taking the common parts of each and roll it out in their. So so it's become like the standard across the world. Uh, so there's a related question. Like essentially, is do you expect the EU regulation to adjust for businesses that want to operate in Europe from not receiving this painful experience, or do you feel this is now like a baseline that we're going to start and developing the regulation?
I think, and of course, predictions about the future are always dangerous, but I think the AI Act more or less gives us a baseline. And I think it will happen similarly to what happened with GDPR. GDPR set the standard for privacy. Some countries then came up with their own proposal, but they're variations on the theme, right? The CCPA is a variation on GDPR. And I think we'll see something similar compared to the AI Act. That said, the keen observer of EU politics, the commissioner that was responsible for passing the Act, Thierry Breton, resigned recently. And in the new von der Leyen Commission, the responsibility that for AI has actually been split up between different commissioners. And there's a new word going around Brussels that should make our ears perk up, and that's tech sovereignty. I don't know what's coming there, but those of us who are interested in AI and are using AI should pay close attention to what happens there.
Awesome. So then I think the most important question to probably end this conversation is, what is the time for complying with AI Act's regulation, and how should companies compliance efforts in the short term?
So if we're going straight by the EU AI Act, you have until the end of January next year to get rid of prohibited systems and train your workforce. So you have to demonstrate that your workforce is trained to use AI as required for their job. In 10 months, we have the deadline for the LLM providers to tell us what's in them. And we have 22 months for all high risk systems to have completed the process of being certified to be on the EU market. So that is, I think, the hardest deadline. From the market perspective, I see much shorter deadlines from these tech companies now saying, we're not going to buy from you unless you're certified. So they're not waiting 2 years. They want to make sure their supply chain is in order much sooner than that.
So essentially, the time is now to operate. Cool. I guess that's basically our session for today. If you have any closing comments, Kevin, wrap up this conversation, please do. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us these illuminating insights.
It's been a pleasure to be here and to have discussed this fascinating topic with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining this conversation. As Kevin says, I think it's time to get ready and getting your AI in order and putting in your governance practices. Uh, Please reach out to us if you have any further questions. Thank you.